And let's move on into our next topic. And if you're on YouTube, you're confused right now because you're like, wait, Dave was just sitting across the desk from Ricky. Ricky was also in a different shirt. Like, Ricky's in a different attire. I don't even know if I'm going to wear these shorts on Friday when Dave and I record the Superfans podcast as it is normally scheduled. But I know this ain't the beginning of the podcast, but I got to welcome him into the podcast. Brandon Swanson, how you doing?
Doing well, Ricky. Thanks so much for having me.
This is your first appearance on the Chicago podcast that we call Superfans, and now you are an official MVP Superfan as well. So how does it feel actually being on a podcast that, you know, people want to hear us talk about Chicago sports, not where it's like, oh, it's the onside kick. Why do you talk so much about the Bears? How does it feel?
Well, it's cool to be on for sure. I think that when you actually say that the podcast is going to be centered around Chicago sports, all of a sudden people want to come and actually listen, as opposed to when, you know, before all they want to listen for is, you know, some stupid team on the West Coast. I mean, it'd be like, why aren't you talking about my Dodgers?
Brandon's attack on the West Coast continues. You want to take a dig at Pac-12 football while you're at it?
Yeah.
Because you haven't done that in a while.
Well, no need to. I'm asleep.
Brandon's asleep. But
I'm kidding. I actually really enjoy the West Coast. Wish I could move there.
But before we move into everything, I'm going to pitch Twitch. Make sure to follow us on twitch.tv/MostValPodcast. Eventually, I got the new lens, so you guys have been noticing that focus thing doesn't happen, or is what some people have called it, the ghost of the MVP studios ain't messing with the camera no more.
Yeah, that's what it is.
I called the Ghostbusters in. They ain't afraid of no ghosts, and they got all of our ghosty problems done with their, what are they called? Not flux. Is it a flux capacitor? I don't even remember.
Asking the wrong guy.
The Ghostbusters was an 80s thing. I watched it. I was never huge on the Ghostbusters like I am like Star Wars and everything. But we called them. They took care of our ghosts. So we will be going on live eventually for most of our podcasts. Twitch.tv/MostValPodcast is where that'll happen. Go ahead and give us a follow. But Brandon, I called you in here. I came up, tapped my left arm. Dave, he's hitting the showers right now. He'll be back for the last segment. But he's hitting the showers right now. I'm calling in the lefty, although you're not a lefty.
I am not.
I'm calling in the reliever here. Let's see who's the reliever from the Phillies that the funny viral video went around where he ran in and tired himself out and JT Realmuto like kind of rolled his eyes at him.
I can't remember, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
Maybe we don't have enough room for that. You can't be running in out of nowhere to come in out of the bullpen, but we got to talk Chicago Cubs today because it happened. The guy I thought they were going to hire, the guy everybody thought they were going to hire, is now the manager of the Chicago Cubs. David Ross, Grandpa Rossi, however you want to call him, is now the manager to take over for the Chicago Cubs. And of course, we're going to talk about what this means for the Cubs, what it means for their future. But the first thing I want to ask you kind of goes away from that, goes even away of before we get into like what you think. The first thought I had about this was something Sean said when we talked about who could be the next manager of the Cubs. And we talked about Theo's, it was either when we talked about who could be the next manager of the Cubs, or it was in our segment about Theo's comments when he called this season disappointing, or how the team is going as disappointing. And one of the things Theo said, Sean brought it up, he said that they want to move on from 2016. 2016 was great, but they want to move on from it. And one of the things Sean brought up for why you don't hire David Ross is that kind of contradicts each other. How can you move away from 2016 with David Ross being one of the key guys that won them the World Series, was the emotional leader in that clubhouse? First thing I want to ask you is, does this move contradict comments that Theo has made that the Cubs organization wants to move away from 2016 and move on from it? It's good, it's great, but it's done. We have to move on. Does this contradict that move by hiring David Ross?
Well, I'd say that On the outset of it, yeah, it does, because David Ross was part of that 2015 and then 2016 team. And you look at that, and anyone who thinks that Theo actually wants to move on from that, well, no, he doesn't. He wants to be back in 2016. He wants to have that success they had in 2016. You can't blame him for that. I just think that to say you want to move on from that and then hire in a guy who had probably some of the most energy for that team in 2016, and a lot of people, I mean, they have a name for him, Grandpa Rossi. I mean, I think that's a really huge thing for the city of Chicago, for Cubs fans, and for fans across the nation. I mean, they know that. They know who David Ross is, and not whether it's from playing with the Cubs during that time or whether it's from being an analyst on ESPN and doing some of the games there. He's a very knowledgeable baseball guy, and I think that it'll be very interesting to see what happens with him as the Cubs manager. But for Theo to say that he wants to move on from 2016 and then make this move, I think clearly he's contradicting himself.
What did you think when the news came out? Because I know you texted me. As a Cub fan, I love it, because the one thing I mentioned when we were in a managerial search after we fired Joe, who's going to do fine things with Mike Trout in L.A., is I didn't really care if the guy we got had managerial experience. The big thing I wanted was who can manage these personalities in the locker room, because I love my Cubs, but I'll be completely honest, we're not the toughest mentally. And I don't mean that as like a dig of like, oh, these snowflakes these days. But we're not mentally a tough team. Like Anthony Rizzo's a prime candidate where he's a great player. When he's on, he's on. But there have been times where it's like, we've even talked about how it's like, what's going on with Anthony Rizzo? How many times he needed Grandpa Rossi to kind of talk him up during that 2016 year, and how much we heard about that. So, I mean, we're still a team that I wouldn't say is the strongest mentally, and some people may disagree with me there, but we've got a ton of fucking talent. And that's why I didn't care who we got for the X's and O's side. It's all about managing the personalities and the minds that we have in the mentalities, I should say, in this locker room. What was your first thought, though, when the Cubs, David Ross, manager of the Chicago Cubs?
So I'm going to be honest with you. I want to go a little farther back than that.
Go ahead. You mean further back than 2016, or
no? I want to go further back from talking about David Ross as the new manager for the Cubs. So
go ahead.
I want to go back to when there was the discussion, and it really started last year, that Joe Maddon could be out.
Yeah.
When I heard that, I thought, this is ridiculous. It makes no sense. Why would Joe Maddon be out? Joe Maddon brought the first World Series to the Chicago Cubs in 108 years. And now, because the Cubs have a mediocre season, because their players, not Joe Maddon, nothing he did, their players weren't performing, some injuries here and there, that's the grind of 162 games. Cubs didn't play well, and the Cardinals took off in the division. I mean, they really did. I mean,
made moves.
I mean that
like even last year,
those things happen. I think this was like an overreaction Monday, but in the sense of a season. And I think that Theo just made a real big overreaction here. Joe Maddon, I would have never gotten rid of Joe Maddon. Joe Maddon is not a bad manager. And I understand that people could say, well, the guys weren't buying into him anymore. I don't know if that's true. I don't fully believe that that's true at all. And I know that people could say, well, Joe the guys wearing the funny outfits and stuff like that on the plane rides back, that just wasn't doing anything anymore. Well, maybe they need to play better. I just think that the Cubs this past season, they were trash. I mean, they were just bad. And I think any Cub fan would also say that, because guaranteed they said that out loud out of their mouth at some point during the season. And the Cubs to end the year, to go on a 9-game losing skid, no one would have or could have ever predicted that it would be that bad. And it was that bad. But Joe Maddon, in the 5 years that he was with the Cubs, he had 2 first-place finishes, with one of them being the World Series, a second-place finish back in 2018, which if you look at that, you look at the fact that the Cubs had back-to-back games where they had a chance to clinch a playoff spot and potentially then make a run. They couldn't win any of those 2 games that they had at home, back-to-back games. They couldn't win them. Couldn't beat the Brewers, couldn't beat the Rockies. And then it got really rocky. If Joe Maddon and the Cubs win those 2 games, we're not talking about Joe Maddon being gone from the Cubs. But it's the overreaction from Theo. And I really just think that it was a disservice done to Joe Maddon for the way that all the great things that he brought to Chicago, the people who complained and complained and complained for years that they weren't doing well, that they didn't have a good manager, that all this stuff. Then you finally have a good manager, and after 5 years, you poo-poo him away. I think that's bullshit.
Yeah, and we had a discussion on Superfans before Joe Maddon got fired. It was like episode 1 or episode 2. And it was, should the Cubs move on from Joe Maddon? And I was staunch in if I'm Theo, I don't fire Joe Maddon. Because I was the same thing you just said. It's not Joe Maddon's fault we played bad. When we brought Joe Maddon in, when Joe Maddon became the manager, it was very apparent to me that Joe wasn't an X's and O's kind of guy. Where it was like, he had the experience of being in Tampa. He has that experience with the X's and O's. It's not like David Ross, who's completely green to being a manager. But the thing that Joe Maddon was able to do is bring that lightheartedness, bring that kind of just not take the game too seriously. Keep the guys loose, keep it fun kind of a thing. And the thing that I wonder is, first, I understand why Theo made the move he did, because the comments that he made about the season being disappointing, Theo, in his mind, had a expectation for this team. We won a World Series in 2016. We should now be competing for World Series. We shouldn't be a team that loses a 1-game playoff against the Brewers in our home stadium. I'm going back to last year. Last year was the crushing one. Like, I would have thought, how do I want to phrase this? I would have been more understanding if the Cubs fired Joe Maddon after last year than after this year. Because if you think about last year we had a lead in the division going into August, September. The Brewers had a hot end of the year and caught up to us, tied us in the division. We have a 1-game playoff at home, and we lose that game. I remember my work schedule was phenomenal last year, where Monday I had 3 classes in the morning and then planned periods throughout the whole day. So I was able to, at work, watch that, that entire Cubs-Brewers game. And I was fuming at that game.
Yeah.
Because of how bad we played.
You had every reason to. I mean, that was a poorly played game by the Cubs.
And then we played the Rockies in our home stadium. Again, another home game. And I get that it's not a for sure that the home team always wins in baseball. Look at the Nationals. Nationals won at home in their wild card game, but then beat a higher seeded team in the Dodgers. Beat a higher seeded team. Swept a higher seeded team in the Cardinals, which I think I've become national fans this year because they beat the Brewers and beat the Cardinals, and they did exactly what I wanted them to, because screw the Brewers, screw the Cardinals, go Cubs. And that's, so it's not necessarily we were at home, we should win, but I feel like we should have won that game at home. It was didn't it end up being a 1-0 game, if my memory serves me, that Rockies game?
I can't remember.
I have to go back and look. But it was a close game throughout, and we lost it late. We lost it in extras, is how we lost it. And the thing I just feel like this year, you're right. It's not Joe Maddon's fault. It's the players' fault. And the thing I want to kind of, with moving this from Joe into now David Ross, is everything I've heard, and I'm going to use Mark Teixeira as the kind of lead man for this, because Before the World Series game on ESPN2, they were talking about it. If you go to the ESPN Cub page, his video of him talking about it on that set is the first thing where it's like, oh, it's a phenomenal move. It's the good thing for this. You don't need a guy who's X's and O's. Here's my worry about this move. I love the move. I'm glad that David Ross is the manager. But here's my one worry, and I want to ask you if I'm right in worrying about this. I relate it to my own life, where David Ross, the player, how is David Ross, the player, going to be different than David Ross, the manager? And the one example I use is it was either Teixeira or Tim Kirkchin.
I love it.
Who basically, one of them said it, where David Ross is a tough guy, where back in 2016, he wouldn't be afraid to call someone out. Like, really? You're calling off today because you got an upset stomach? Like, really? That's why we're calling off today? That's why we ain't playing today? Kind of like that. Come on, you're being a wuss. Get out there and play some baseball. And the thing that I think about when I heard that was the delivery as a fellow teammate compared to the manager. And I relate it to my own life as a teacher. Whereas the one high school that I graduated from, when I was in college still, I emailed their director and I said, hey, do you mind if is there opportunity I can teach some private lessons, help out with teaching? You don't have to pay me. I'm just looking for the experience while in college to kind of work with kids and kind of get a foothold into what being a teacher really is. And I was blessed to be able to work with that band program. And there was a difference, though, between college student, where when I was still a college student, the seniors who were there they weren't freshmen when I was there, but they were like, there were a few of them that knew me because either they had brothers or sisters that went to high school with me, or they were still young enough to have known who I was. So to them, I wasn't Mr. Widmer. I was Ricky. Well, when I graduated and became a teacher and then got hired pseudo part-time at the high school to work with the band, it was, all right, I'm Mr. Widmer. And those kids were now seniors at the time. Or the students that were freshmen who grew up calling me Ricky were now seniors. And it was really hard. It was like nails on a chalkboard, trying to drill it in their head that, no, I'm not your friend. I'm part of the teachers. And I know that it's different, baseball and teaching, but I wonder if that same thing can be relayed here. Whereas when Dave Ross was the player, certain things like that may land differently. And if you're a teammate, one of the older teammates, you can get away with saying that. Whereas now in this situation, now that you're the manager, is it going to land differently now that he's the manager compared to the player? But to play devil's advocate on that, is it like something like Pat McAfee said on his show, where he was talking about NFL locker rooms, and he said, in high school and college, coach says something, the player buys into it because you're looking up to them. In the NFL, there's so much knowledge. The players have so much knowledge to where, like, one time they traded A.Q. Shipley, and the Colts players didn't agree with it. And Chuck Pagano came in and said, you just got to believe in the system, believe in what we're doing here. And the players were like, no, we're not buying in. We're not. Do you see any worry in what I'm saying? Is how he was able to be tough on this team as a teammate different than how we can be tough on this team as a manager, or are they one and the same? The title doesn't matter at all.
So I'll go back for a brief moment.
Because I know I rambled.
You didn't ramble. You really made some tied some good examples together. What I'll go back to is your question at the beginning of what did I think of the hire. So What Theo was doing, what I truly believe Theo was doing was he knew he was losing the fans. He knew he was losing the fans because of the season that it was and that people were upset. I mean, they had seen what the Cubs had been for the last couple of years, which has been a successful team. They're at the top for the number 1 spot or the number 2 spot with a chance for the playoffs. This past year, they were sunk. Only won 84 games. It was ugly.
Yeah.
And he knew he was losing the fans. So what he did is he made the most fan-friendly move he possibly could to win them back. And he did. And he got David Ross. People loved it. I said it at the beginning. The city of Chicago loves David Ross. They love him. I'm a White Sox fan. I like David Ross. I think he seems like a special guy, a nice guy, a likable guy, an approachable guy. Now, those are all great things. Those are all great things to be a manager.
Yeah.
I do wonder, the guys that played with him, and Chris Bryan already, Anthony Rizzo, Chris Bryan, they already say, I really looked at him as a coach when he was here anyways. But he wasn't.
Yeah.
But he wasn't. He wasn't your coach.
And that's why he wasn't
he wasn't your manager. He may have acted like that. He may have had that presence with you, but he wasn't. That wasn't his title. Now he's not going out onto the field with you. He's not, in the game, in the locker room the same way that he was before. It is different. It is different. And it's going to be interesting to see, okay, maybe some of the young guys in the Cubs we know is, still a young team. The young guys may quickly buy right in and everything like that, but if Javi Baez is now on the cover of MLB 20, the show.
Can't wait to buy it.
Javi Baez thinks a lot of Javi Baez. We know it. He's an arrogant guy. Good player, arrogant guy, well out of position for a lot of the plays he makes, which is why they end up being so crazy and good. He's out of position, though. I'm just going to throw that out there. If he doesn't necessarily buy into something with David Ross, he knows it better. Javi knows it better. But Ross is putting it out there. How's that going to go? How's that going to go? Then do you have some divide right there? Then do some guys, go with Javi and then they're against David Ross? That's a worst case scenario. But it could happen. And I'm not saying necessarily just for Javi, but I'm using that as an example. Something like that could happen. And then if one guy, like a Javi Baez, is able to influence some of the young guys, all of a sudden you've got turmoil in your locker room. And that's not what you want if you're a Cub fan. You want to believe that David Ross is coming in and it's going to be ho-hum harmony, kumbaya in a circle with everyone before and after games. And as much as I think there's going to be a lot of that throughout the offseason, there's going to be changes with the Cubs too. I don't know if Theo's done making moves.
Well, and
so I just want to wrap that up with everything's going to be great through the offseason. Everyone's going to be lovey-dovey. Everything's going to be wonderful. I'm very interested to see how things are beginning of the season next year when, okay, here are the pieces to play with. Thanks, Theo. And now Ross. The biggest criticism, I think, for Joe Maddon while he was here towards the end, he wasn't using the bullpen the right way. Does David Ross know how to use the bullpen the right way, quote unquote, the right way? Is there a right way? Yeah. But does he know how to manage that? That's where I think fans are going to be the most critical, because that's where they felt that Joe Maddon towards the end fell down the most, was on how he was using and utilizing his bullpen. Will Ross know how to use it the right way for Chicago fans?
One question and one thing that I think will be interesting this year. I'll start with the interesting thing of, I wonder, when it comes to X's and O's, the one X's and O's thing I can't wait to see from David Ross is, what does his hire mean for Wilson Contreras? Because Wilson Contreras, we've Great bat. There have been times in the field it's like not the best defensive catcher. And it's been shown where sometimes take Contreras out, put Lucroy in to be more of the defensive side. I didn't think they put it Carantini. I think it was more Lucroy. Even Maldonado before we traded him to the Astros, who he's playing right now. I want to know, and I want to see what that relationship is like. Does Wilson Contreras learn things from David Ross, being a catcher in this league and being a battery mate for John Lester? Does having John Lester still on this team help out David Ross, where it's like John Lester's basically in the clubhouse, the right-hand guy for if a thing like you mentioned, if let's say Javi does that, does John Lester step in to break it down? Where it's like, hey, come on, like we all know each other kind of a thing. It's going to be interesting to see how this works. The thing that's even more interesting, and I know Pat, I don't want to get too much into it because I know Pat Hill, one of our patrons, wants to come on Superfans and talk about this. He wants to talk about who could be traded this offseason from the Cubs, because if you look at it, after this year, Contreras is up for arbitration this year. You've got Ben Zobrist, who's an unrestricted free agent now after this year. You've got Chris Bryant, who is up for arbitration this year. Javi Baez, it says up for arbitration. Addison Russell, arbitration. Kyle Schwarber, arbitration. Albert Almora, arbitration. Nick Castellanos, I think he walks, but he's a UFA.
I don't think he walks.
You don't think so? You think he resigns?
I think he resigns with the Cubs. The two guys that I would be interested in.
And then I was going to mention just Cole Hamels and a lot of our bullpen, like 5 guys in our bullpen, all free agents.
I think Nick Castellanos stays with the Cubs. I think he'll resign. But the two guys that I'm looking at that I'm really interested in, that I truly believe have a chance of leaving, are Schwarber and Bryant.
Yeah.
I mean, I really do. I think that they've been the young guys, and they're still young guys, but, they were the guys that really kind of came up with the Cubs, right at the beginning of their kind of run to the World Series in terms of, 15, there a lot of excitement, things are happening, blah, 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 all this stuff, and then 16 when they really go, 17 when they're, still really competitive and everything like that. I think, these two guys have been staples for the Chicago Cubs, and they really have. And I could see one or both of them for the right price being traded away.
So I want to mention one thing, and this is something
or walking.
I know this is off the David Ross thing. This is off the Cub thing. But I've battled this through the playoffs this year. I am so happy we won that World Series, because if we didn't, you know what would haunt me to this day? You know what would haunt me to this day if we didn't win that World Series? If Rajai Davis was the hero that he was that night up until we crushed the Cleveland dream, like what usually happens with Cleveland, their dreams get crushed. We could have had an infield of Anthony Rizzo at first, Javi Baez at second, Chris Bryant at third, Gleyber Torres at shortstop. Because I don't think you put Gleyber at second. Like Gleyber and Javi, obviously both their main positions are shortstop, but like Javi's played second for us, so that's why I put him at second. Like that could have been our infield. But we won the World Series. Roldis Chapman. That's why we made that trade. That is something this playoffs that I've just watched Gleyber Torres and been like, selfish Cub fan Ricky, I would have loved to see an alternate reality where he's in a Cub uniform and not Yankee pinstripes. Because I love Gleyber Torres. You don't know how much I love Gleyber Torres.
Brandon. I'm getting the vibe you like him a lot, but he's been an outstanding player. He really has.
But I do agree with you. Chris Bryant, I would hate to see go, but I do think Kyle Schwarber's time in Chicago is done. because he can't play the field.
I think it's done. He's got to be traded to an American League team. He's a DH. He's a DH. I mean, we know it. I mean, Cub fans have known it. They try and look past it, and then if he makes a good play, they're like, see, he's coming around. He's not coming around. Yeah. He is a hitter. Mm-hmm. I mean, he is the biggest hitter that there is, and he's not a field guy. And so he's going.
And we got Ian Happ, who is a better fielder.
For him to be the most successful, he's going to go to an American League team, and he's going to be a DH.
Mm-hmm. Like our outfielder, like we got, even like let's say Castellanos resigns, then what? Our outfield is then Jason Hayward, who we're paying, Castellanos, who we'd be paying, and then I'm assuming Albert Almora is our center fielder, and then Ian Happ, he almost reminds me as like a mini Schwarber because of his power. So it's like. That's the guy. I don't want to get too much into it because, of course, Pat wants to talk about it, but that's the one thing I would do. I'll ask you this. Look into your crystal ball. At the end of the David Ross tenure, what are we saying? Give me a headline, like an ESPN, The Score, what's the headline when David Ross gets fired or let go from the Cubs after how many years he's the manager? What are we looking at?
Well, would have loved to have gotten a little bit more time to put this headline together and do my article.
Or just a thought.
But I think that what we're going to see at the end of the David Ross era is that he is going to be, I think, See, David Ross, and I like him. I think he brings a great energy and a great passion and everything like that to the game. I really do. And he may end up being an outstanding manager. Mm-hmm. But if I was the Cubs, I would have been going for Joe Girardi, a proven manager, someone who's obviously done really great things with the New York Yankees. Obviously, the Yankees had great talent, but
has ties to the Cubs.
But Girardi has also been proven to be able to manage all of these personalities, and the Yankees have plenty. Mm-hmm. We know it. I'm not saying that David Ross hasn't. We have to give him a chance. You have to give him a chance. But I think that we're going to be seeing something, a headline along the lines of, Ross was a great player, great energy guy for the Chicago Cubs, but never quite was able to get over the hump. And I think that part of that is maybe because of the fact that he played with them. Mm-hmm. And some of that may go away if guys like Schwarber leave, Bryant leave, Rizzo leave. I mean, if any of that happens, I mean, you're looking at a new Cub ball club. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's not even ending up to be an issue. But I really think that the reason why Theo went with David Ross is because he was the favorite pick. Theo needed to win the fan base back. Mm-hmm. My thought is also, how long is Theo going to be in town? I mean, when's he going to move on to the next team to build them up? I mean, he's done great with the Chicago Cubs, but how much longer is he going to be there? I mean, his pieces. I mean, if Schwarber, Bryant, Rizzo, I mean, let's just say those guys go. Mm-hmm. Those are his centerpieces. I mean, you obviously look at Baez and stuff like that too, but there's your centerpieces for your championship team. Mm-hmm. And now, and then let's say, poof, they're gone. What are you working with? I mean, the Cubs farm system has been notably weakened because of all the prospects they gave away to get these great guys. Mm-hmm. And then when they go, you're left with a farm system that needs to be rebuilt, and it does need to be rebuilt for the Chicago Cubs right now. I mean, that's why you look at and I'm a Chicago White Sox fan. As a White Sox fan, I'm getting excited because I feel like our window is just beginning for a potential playoff run, for playoff appearances, stuff like that. I won't even get crazy and talk about World Series at this point, but we have the pieces in the majors. We have many more pieces that are ready in the minors and many more that are going to be groomed to be ready in the minors. That's just beginning. The Cubs are on the end of theirs. So unless Theo's able to build that back up, and by building that back up, you're going to have to trade some of your centerpiece guys or close to centerpiece guys to get more of those prospects or get other, major league ready talent. But it's hard to do that if you don't have the prospects, which really the Cubs don't have right now. So that's why it's those windows of opportunity. And for the Cubs to have won that World Series, that was huge back in 2016. Because if they don't win that, they may not have another window for another 10, 15 years. Who knows? I mean, it's that's why it's so crucial to when you get those pieces, you want to make the right moves. I mean, everything the Cubs did in 2016 just seemed to be perfect. The moves for Chapman and this and that and the other thing. I mean, everything's fell into place, and that's the type of thing that needs to happen for baseball teams. To just go off on one more quick note is that
go ahead.
Anyone who's worried about David Ross being a first-time manager, do not fret. Dave Martinez was a first-time manager in 2018 for the Nationals. He went 82-80.
I got this lined up already.
They're in the World Series right now. In his second year.
I was gonna say, out of all the managers in the playoffs, not wild card, playoffs. So the NLDS, ALDS, and beyond. You've got Brian Snitker with the Braves. Before he became the manager in 2016. Didn't have any managerial experience. Dave Roberts, before he became the manager in 2016, he had 1 year. He was 1 year as the Padres skipper, and then he's with the Dodgers. You have Mike Schilt of the Cardinals. Before he became the manager last year, no managerial experience. Dave Martinez, the same thing, like you said. Kevin Cash of the Rays, no experience before 2015 when he came in. Rocco Baldelli, no experience before he came in. Aaron Boone, which this could be a very Aaron Boone type of move because Aaron Boone's doing the same thing that David Ross is. No managerial experience, coming right out of the Baseball Tonight Sunday Night Baseball booth. Coming from the ESPN booth into the team. But the only manager with experience of like significant time is Houston's, which is AJ Hinch, who was 2 years as the manager of the D-backs before he came over to the Astros in 2015. But that was like 09-010, and then in 15 he was the manager of the Astros. So, I mean, one person who is significant, like him and Dave Roberts, are the only ones with managerial experience.
What I want to say there about Aaron Boone is that what the Yankees have done, though, is they have made sure that they have not lost any of their core players.
Yes.
The Cubs...
Aaron Judge.
The Cubs... Aaron Judge, they added Stanton. They have Torres. They have...
Gary Sanchez.
Gary Sanchez. So there's a core right there already. And then their pitching staff has been good. Their relievers have been solid. What the Cubs can't afford to do, they have to find ways to keep this core together as long as possible.
No, they do.
They can't allow these guys to walk because those windows... And they're probably much smarter guys than me sitting in their front office, that the window of opportunity is always small, unless you're the Yankees or the Red Sox, it seems. But even the Red Sox this year had a down year, and they got rid of their GM. That didn't make sense to me. I complained about that earlier in the year. But that's why it's so important to keep your core together at all costs. And you hope that you keep the guys together for the Chicago Cubs, because if you do, you have to believe that every year you have a chance at winning that division and going to the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a core right there. You've got Rizzo. You've got Bryant. You've got Contreras. You've got Schwarber. Mm-hmm. You've got Happ. I mean, and then the pitching staff, which was improved. Darvish went from being a complete waste of space to actually pitching well this year.
Yeah.
It's like what's going on? Where was this the last couple of years?
He sucked all the energy out of everyone else. Everyone else wasn't that good.
Yeah.
And then he was good. It's like you can't get the timelines to match.
You can't. You know that you have this good core group, and I understand, how contracts work, and you've got to get certain people their money. You got to do this, and you got to do that, whatever. But you do whatever you can to keep that core group as long as possible, because those windows, while they're great when they're happening, after 3 years, and it's all of a sudden beginning to tighten and close because everyone now wants to get paid, that is really tough to keep those guys together. But if you are, and if Theo is, people are going to be a big Theo fan again, because I feel like, and you're a big Cub fan, Ricky, I feel like people have started to, not necessarily sour, not the right word, but they've started to question Theo. This past season, especially when you're not winning and you end the year on a 9-game skid, it's easy to question every move made by your GM and your manager. And I think that that's kind of where people are. And now this David Ross hire, it has them, I think, Theo back in the good graces. But there needs to just be everything possible done to keep this core together as long as possible, because we know what happens when you can't. All of a sudden, guys start to, go away. Yes, you get prospects, but who knows how quickly they're able to come to the majors, and then do they pan out? Number of times, prospects don't pan out from big deals. Centerpiece prospects that don't always pan out.
Well, and the thing that I also want to, last thing I'm going to touch, because the talent is important, and of course you get everyone like the Mark Teixeiras and the main level guys are saying, oh, well, David Ross has got talent. Like, he shouldn't have anything to worry about there. He can just be the guy and to be the emotional leader of this team. Well, it's like you said, how long is this core going to be together? And if that core is not, that's going to be the big thing to what we look at later on. If this core's together and they don't produce, that's one thing. But if we trade Chris Bryant, if we trade Kyle Schwarber, well, okay, we're weakening this team, and then we may have to lean on the X's and O's of David Ross, because the one thing I want to throw out there, and this was just a short thing, that SB Nation did their Rewinder series on Game 7 of the Cubs and Indians.
Yeah.
And you know what I didn't notice watching that game that they reminded me of? So back when the game was, I don't even remember what inning it was, but in the game, the Indians, while they were up, I believe, took Coco Crisp out of the game in left field because he's a defensive liability. It was right after Rajai Davis gave them the lead. They took Coco Crisp out of the game because they wanted a defensive guy in there, and Michael Martinez was that guy. Well, the Cubs came back, tied it, took the lead. Who made the last out in that World Series? Michael Martinez. If they never pulled him, Coco Crisp would have been at the plate, and it might have been a different outcome in that World Series. So even something that small can affect a big moment, and that's the thing with this team, it's the talent. Can David Ross get the talent back to what it was doing in 2016, and how much of that talent is still going to be there? That's because this season, I think Theo's going to still make moves. Theo's not up. It was all Joe Maddon. Like, I don't think he's like that. And plus, with the contracts, like you said, Theo knows that since there's no salary cap in baseball, the Cubs are doing a lot of things to get income. They got that new area out front. They got the brand new hotel that they're building. This next year, the Marquee Sports Network that is going to be the exclusive home to all the Cub games. It has some games like who we know who's been on the channel, Pete Creighton, who he's even said he hates the Marquee Network mainly because of one, I think he said his grandfather can't watch Cub games anymore because they're not going to be on local TV. And number two, they're owned by the Marquee Network is going to be owned by the Sinclair Broadcast Group, which they're not the most ethical broadcast group, is what I'll say. And it's just like, it's got some people shaken up, but that's supposed to be bringing in money for this team that this team can then use to hopefully pay the players that they want to keep around and be the talent on this team. I would assume. That's what I assume it would be because there's no salary cap in baseball.
Yeah, I really hope that things go really well for David Ross. He seems like a very stand-up guy, he always seemed like when he was with the Cubs as a player that he was a really good positive force in that clubhouse. Yeah. And then obviously, on the field too, he had some really big moments for the Chicago Cubs, and that's why everyone loves him. I mean, the city of Chicago loves him, and I just hope, as grueling as Chicago can be for sports, we know that quite well. I hope that they don't lose that love for him, because it was so great. And this is something that I think sometimes can be bad too. And I'm trying not to make it a negative, but all right, he does all these great things for you. You love him as a player, everything like that. And then, you bring him back as the manager. It's not going so well. Then all of a sudden people are soured.
Why did we get rid of Joe Maddon?
And then people are soured on David Ross. And, a city that once loved him. And Chicago is a city that'll do this to you. The same people that were rooting for Mitch Trubisky last year and saying, yeah, Mitch, he seems to be our guy. They now hate him and want him gone. So
there's a meatpacking place. Sean hates when I bring it up on Superfans, but I do, that I pass going to work. For the past few weeks, you know what it said? At this point, do we bring Cutler back? Like, that's just Chicago for you. Like, if you're doing well for us, we love you. If you're not, the pitchforks are out. Get them out of town. Like, that's just who we are.
But it's one of those things where...
And if you win a championship, you drink for free.
Yep.
Free drinks and free food for life.
Yeah. And it's crazy because as excited as Cub fans are right now, and as much love as they have towards David Ross for the couple of years that he was with the club, and for obviously the one important year that he was with the club when they won it in 2016, I hope that's not lost.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, the saddest thing would be for a guy who went from being so revered in the city of Chicago to, if he were to just fall by the wayside as any other guy who didn't get the job done, so he's been outcast by the city. I would hate to see that happen because he does seem like a really good guy, and he has been such I think, a staple for Chicago Cub fans and the city of Chicago as well, I think.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that this is a good thing for the Chicago Cubs. I want us back in the playoff, and it sucked this year watching playoff games and being like. And that's why I feel like I want the Nationals to win, is because I feel like what they're doing right now is how I felt pre-World Series about the Cubs, where it's like I watched their game where Howie Kendrick hit that home run, and I'm like, God, if I was a National fan, would this feel like when Schwarber hit that home run against the Dodgers, or when Miguel Montero hit the home run against the Dodgers? Is that the emotion that they're feeling? It's like, I don't get to feel that because my team's not in the playoffs.
Yeah.
And the last moment I have of them is a 3-1 shit loss at home against the Brewers, and then a 2-1 loss where we lost it in 13 innings to the Rockies. So, I mean, I hope this is a good thing. I hope the Cubs do better. I can't wait to see what they do. I want to thank you, Brandon. This has been, first off, your first appearance on Superfans. And you want to know how long this segment has gone?
How long?
A 50-minute gem.
Wow.
Of a conversation. A great conversation about David Ross. And this is where you guys come in. If you haven't already, let us know what you think down below in the comment section. Cub fans, you like the move, don't like the move? Is this Theo just trying to win us over? Is David Ross going to get the shit back on track? What do you think about this hire of David Ross being the manager of the Chicago Cubs?